Carl Gustav Jung. He was born after one girl 5 years before him, stillborn, another girl stillborn 3 years before his birth, and a boy who lived for 5 days only. Now he was called Paul. Paul was the name of the father of Jung. It would have been a catastrophe if now Carl Gustav would have been called Paul. It's one of the things to avoid, if possible, in a situation where loss is to give a name, a first name, to a descendant that recalls the absent other. He was called Carl Gustav, but Carl Gustav was his grandfather, and his grandfather had lost 3 wives and 6 children to tuberculosis. So not just war and accidents and diseases, but of course also epidemics have claimed many lives, and the French research has been very, very helpful in that respect to bring that into consciousness, what happens in the aftermath. He asked, is there anything more fundamental than the realization, this is what I am? I'm actually presenting to you Jung as a replacement child, as a case. I'm not sure he was aware that he was a replacement child and that this had consequences. This concept wasn't existing really at his time. You see, the first article is in 1964, he died in 1961. But this question goes through all of his works. It's a fundamental red thread or a golden thread. He is searching in the unconscious for who am I? And he doesn't say this is who I am, he says what I am. And that's an important concept. It goes towards the self. Jung's psychology stipulates in us is a self, a force in us that wants us to become the person we can become in the individuation process. And this force, the self, is actually kind of inspired or supported or pushed by the archetypal self. And the what refers to the self, the I, the conscious me, Jan, you, I. We are born out of the self. This is what I am means the I born, or as I will argue, reborn, a psychological rebirth of the ego, of the conscious I of a replacement child from the self. This is the hopeful dynamic. So Jung, in his lifetime, in his autobiography, he says, seems to me miraculous, I should not have been prematurely annihilated. Says, an unconscious suicidal urge, a fatal resistance to life in this world. But equally many passages in his work, which I call his lifetime's work for his life, actually insist on saying, you must strive after your own being. You have to become yourself. You have to seek consciousness and differentiate yourself from the contents in the unconscious. And what happens to replacement child is largely in the unconscious until we become conscious thereof. He also said, somewhere deep in the background, I always knew that I was 2 persons. One was a schoolboy of 1890, and the other who knew God as a hidden, personal, and at the same time supra-personal secret. This is the self. For Jung, God and the self, the archetypal self, are equivalent. Therefore, the individuation process denotes the process by which a person can become a psychological individual, not somebody who replaces, somebody who is unique, separate, indivisible, a unity, whole. who is not divided between a conscious part, a conscious I'm me, but unconsciously I'm a replacement child, who has brought these sides together. And the self plays a role to support that process, to nudge it, to push it, and frankly sometimes all these nice words really mean we suffer a lot. We suffer, we have symptoms, and that also is part of that force that brings us to consciousness. Hope for an adult replacement child lies in the emergence of self and the rediscovery of the essence of original being in a psychological rebirth. Rebirth, Jung said, is nothing you can prove, is nothing you can see under a microscope happening. It is a psychological experience. But he said, it's metaphysical, but it is a fact. I have now several steps towards healing. The very first step, of course, is about awareness. Many replacement children don't know that they are. Some do know that they are. And some do not know what that really means in so many areas, which I will go into now in some detail. I had recently a message by a person who was 40, and she wrote, born 2 years after my brother died, almost my whole life I'm asking myself why I feel so much responsibility, so much guilt, why it's so easy to trigger me if someone does not take me seriously, why I have been battling with so many fears all my life, and why I could not separate from my parents, feeling responsible to rescue them. I did therapy with practitioners from different schools, but the concept of the replacement child was never mentioned. Awareness. That's why I wrote the book. That's why I'm happy to be here with you. Awareness is really key. And when I become aware, this is what I suffer from, this brings relief. And when I become aware that I'm not alone, this brings relief also. There are 2 fellow authors in America who wrote books with whom I will create an international forum, maybe with you too. It would be wonderful to spread out more awareness, because many people do not know. So many people are affected by this. And even amongst us practitioners, I did 300 hours of analysis and this was not touched. So even in our own professional environment, there will be found many replacement children. One author, the French author, Poirot, said there are 3 ways out of this dilemma. Madness, creativity, which you will show in a moment, Caroline, that being creative, going against that destructive force is a way out. And the 3rd way, he said, was becoming a psychologist. Trying to get to know, trying to find out, getting understanding, getting compassion, transformation. 4th way, of course, in my view the best way, is individuation. That whole, maybe lifelong process of becoming present towards yourself. 2nd step towards healing, recognize the symptoms. And these symptoms can be very varied, like we had in the announcement for this morning. You may just feel ill at ease in life, not know really what you want, where you want to go, wondering who I am, low self-esteem, suffering in relationship with yourself and others. I will explain why that happens. And feeling weighed down by guilt and grief and anger. Very varied symptoms. And I like to look at these symptoms, or even at symbols, rather than at pathology. This is not a pathological condition. We can suffer from it. You may have pathological symptoms, but this is not a disease. This is not a pathology itself. But very often people get diagnosed with depression, traits of a personality disorder, narcissistic or borderline, or even a psychotic episode. I think it's more helpful to look at symptoms, at suffering from symptoms, and at symbols in order to understand. So my whole attitude towards this is you need to have understanding for what happened. We need to have understanding for these matters of life and death. This is an existential issue that replacement children are facing, working through. Steps towards healing, compassionate understanding for core areas. And the core areas will be attachment. Attachment is like early bonding. It's at first phase when you and mother, or you and caretaker, you and parent bond. And the parent is reflecting the image of who you are towards you. In the ideal case, it's the unique you and the replacement child. It may be mixed. Difficulties in early bonding. An image by Egon Schiele, the Austrian painter. Egon Schiele was a replacement child. His mother lost 3 pregnancies before she gave birth to his sister Elvira. And Elvira died 10 years old when Egon Schiele was 3. I didn't go into the detail in this, but it's not just a subsequent child, a child born after. Egon Schiele can be considered a replacement child even though he was already 10 years old and there was a child that died and there were children lost before that. It doesn't necessarily have to be after. And then there was another girl born, his sister Gertrude, who was 1 year, born 1 year after Elvira's death. And this is probably painted from Gertrude's point of view, how a mother looks to a child, even in the womb or when born, who has had so much loss. This kind of mother is called an absent mother. Actually, it's called a dead mother, in quotation marks, because of a concept developed way later in the 60s by André Green, a French psychoanalyst who wrote a wonderful paper translated into English called The Dead Mother. Very helpful to replacement children. He himself was affected and he said that's why it's such a good paper. It really speaks to it. And he says, this is the situation, the baby will try to bring the mother alive. The baby will try to make the mother happy. They will try to give her the life she needs. But the baby does so at the cost of identifying with a whole, with an absence. So if I said before, it's not only projections that we receive, it's also our own possibility to identify in such situations in the very early bonding situation. What the mother feels can flow towards the child. The child is there to bring new life. The child will do maybe anything to make a mother try to smile again. But that means a child takes that sadness into itself at an age where it doesn't even know it's happening, of course. The ego is not developed. Identity. There is likely possible that there are disturbances in identity formation. Quite a shocking image by Salvador Dali. He called it Macbeth. It's a joining, it's a confusion of two beings. This was actually discovered and brought to me by a replacement child of the 2nd generation. Her mother had been a replacement child, replacing a disabled sister. And that image that you just saw from Schiele and that darkness you saw from Delphine had made it difficult for my client Helen and her mother to really connect, see each other, for her to develop a relation to herself and to others. She was extremely lonely. One of the symbols of this condition, or symptoms of this condition rather, is loneliness, extreme loneliness. But we have this confusion, and this confusion is what one needs to recognize and to differentiate, to take this amalgam apart. Salvador Dali was a replacement child. And this is an image he painted 40, 50 years later of his lost brother. Right? You had the confusion, and you have Salvador I, who dies, and 9 months and 10 days later Salvador II is born. And he is very upset. I can read to you what he wrote. My brother died 3 years before I was born. It's not true. It was 9 months and 10 days. The parents made love right around the death of their child. Mix. You remember I said mixing of archetypes. So he says, my fetus swam in a hellish placenta. I felt deep inside a theft of affection. His ghost welcomed me. But I learned to live by filling up the gap of affection, which was not given to me. He thought he would always be second because his parents told him he was a reincarnation of the first Salvador. But he created himself to be absolutely unique. I mean, when you see a work of art of Salvador Dali, you know this is Dali. Yeah? He created an identity which was unique. But he also recognized the impact of the first Salvador onto his life, which is awareness. And 57 years later, he still painted that ghost of his brother. So we had attachment, identity, now grief. Grief. Replacement child carries grief because often this child may be conceived in order to make up for a loss, in order to not grieve, to not do the mourning. I've now sometimes called it the stop grief child. Yeah? Parents may just say, go ahead, go look towards life, give me another one. This was the advice given by doctors and counselors and priests and pastors for centuries. Yeah? So the replacement child carries grief. Vincent van Gogh is a replacement child. Here is this somber, dark atmosphere, the funereal atmosphere described by Kine and Kine in Such a Family. This is an image of Van Gogh trying to catch his mother's attention. She does not see him. She's downcast. He cannot get to her. So the fourth area, attachment, identity, grief, guilt. Guilt is the fourth area. Survivor's guilt. Why do I survive? Why am I here and the other is not? Am I here only because the other is not here? Survivor's guilt was identified in the Holocaust studies as a major factor of suffering. Introjected guilt. Some parents were found by Kine and Kine to make responsible the child that's there for the disappearance of the other, even though the child that's there wasn't even born when the other disappeared. It's a kind of primary process thinking. This child is here, the other is not. It's this child's fault that the other is not, and that can be introjected into the psyche of a replacement child. Then guilt from narcissistic rage, from anger. I'm not seen. I'm not as good as the other idealized absent child. I'm not loved, like Miriam thought she was. And then a kind of existential guilt for lack of self-realization, for not being really yourself. In replacement children, I find there can be a complex of Cain and Abel. You're familiar with Cain and Abel? Cain slay Abel.
Cain, we say.
Cain, thank you. Cain, thank you. Cain and Abel. And Eve says to Adam, God gave me other seed instead of Abel, and that is Seth, S-E-T-H, Seth. So in such a complex that we may unconsciously harbor, there is the slain child, there's Abel, a victim part, and there is maybe a murder part, a Cain. One of my clients did a wonderful painting. He was a replacement child. You can just exactly see what is happening. A kind of ghost-like identity and a warrior. And in his family, people had died in the war. Now there is a very provocative message here. It's kill the dead. One of the authors, Couves, a French author, says, you need to kill the representation of the dead other within yourself in order to be able to come alive yourself. Symbolically, of course. You need to find out that there is such a shadow within, and then that shadow needs to be killed, he says, or taken out, in a less radical formulation. There are some not so very nice images that can come from our unconscious. And I remember giving a talk in 2004, and our colleague Chris Holland said, oh my God, now I understand 30 years ago a dream of a replacement child. He was told, you would not exist unless the other had died. And what did he dream? He dreamt that he had to kill a puppy with a lethal injection in a plastic bag. For those of us who think symbolic, we think of a fetus, we think of a uterus, and it's not nice, but that actually needs to be understood, that this can be in a replacement child's psyche, and that that representation has to be seen and taken out of the psyche. However, in the shadow is not only the murderer of Abel, Cain, and the Jungian concept of shadow is also everything you are not yet, that you don't know that you are. So maybe it's your growth. It's who you really are. And I love this little image where you have this not so nice tree there, kind of withering, and you see the whole growth is actually underneath. And the individuation process for me is bringing that into consciousness.
Fits very nice.